All right. The tension between Garvey and the ranks of America's black leadership increased significantly after June 1922 when Garvey decided to personally meet with Edward Young Clark, the Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Now you see that title, say the KKK was a Christian organization, but as you see, they got a title, the Imperial Wizard. So it's based on animism, you know, animism too. But yeah, it's just a footnote. All right, he met with the Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. The rationale underpinning Garvey's meeting with a prominent Southern Klan leader seems to have been the opportunity to minimize Klan violence against the UNIA, particularly in the South, by reassuring Clark that UNIA wanted essentially the same thing as the Klan, that is, an end to miscegenation and the repatriation of black Americans to Africa. Following Garvey's notorious meeting with Clark, Du Bois' tone in particular became more nativist when he was commenting on UNIA activity, and he frequently cited, Garvey's nationality and skin tone as undesirable qualities. as the as the public dispute between Du Bois and Garvey gathered pace in 1923 and 1924, it had the result of persuading both leaders and many others that unity of position and purpose between people of African descent was an unlikely aspiration, motivated in no small part by Garvey's meeting with Clark. Several prominent black leaders banded together to form the Garvey Must Go campaign, which aimed to enlist USA government support for the removal of Marcus Garvey from a position of influence in the United States. Supporters of this campaign included Chandler Owen, editor of the socialist magazine The Messenger, Robert Abbott of the Chicago Defender, and William Pickens, Walter White, and Robert Bagnall of the NAACP. So let's just note that these are institutions. There's media that gets out the message, puts messages in people's brain. You have media, the written word, and you have NAACP, an organization. So it's about, yeah, it is what it is. But I see, yeah. I just want to comment the NAACP is not exclusively African black uh, in membership, but I think the Urban League is. The Urban League was originally like something to replace the Freedmen's Bureau. You have a Native Americans Bureau or a Bureau of Indian Affairs, a Bureau of Native American Affairs, and there used to be a Bureau of Freedmen, sort of mini reparations resettlement package that became like the Urban League. But it's like, yeah, there's a cause for a freedman bureaucracy, sort of government within a government again, the Freedmen's Bureau. That's what the UNIA kind of was for multiple ethnic groups. But yeah, it's we'll see. We'll see how that develops. But let's keep reading. Yeah, these institutions banded together against Garvey. This development indicates how useful it might be for Garvey's most powerful African American critics to highlight the UNIA's involvement in unrespectable political violence, especially given that Abbott had the ability through the Chicago Defender to disseminate such stories widely. Casting the UNIA in such a light could help to discredit the organization, lure supporters away from it, and lend credence to the federal government's investigations into Garvey's organization, investigations which White and the NAACP were interested in helping with. I think I should start calling it, let me reread that properly. Casting the UNIA in such a light could help to discredit the government of the UNIA, lure supporters away from it, and lend credence to the USA government's investigations into Garvey's government. Investigations with White and the NAACP were interested in helping with. In August 1922, Randolph and Pickens organized an anti-Garvey rally in Harlem, which was attended by a crowd of around 2,000 black people, apparently ready to hear Garvey publicly denounced. Pickens told the crowd that he had received many threats from friends of Garvey that they would not only interrupt the meeting but would do away with him. Pickens said he had been reassured when threatened that Garvey always carries out his threats. Ultimately, the event almost triggered the violence it supposedly condemned. The Bureau of Investigation agent monitoring the proceedings reported that a number of Garveyites were amongst those present. Only the prompt action of police prevented what might have turned out to be serious trouble. The Washington Post alleged that in the same month, Pickens and Randolph held their meetings. Speakers at a series of meetings held by the Friends of Negro Freedom in New York were threatened with death by UNIA supporters, some of whom may have been of Caribbean origin. It is important to note, however, that these meetings of the Friends of Negro Freedom were almost certainly initiated at leadership level rather than occurring spontaneously at grassroots level. They were organized by Chandler Owen and Robert Bagnall, as well as Pickens, Randolph, and were very likely timed and designed to be confrontational. August 1922, for example, was also the month of the annual UNIA convention in Harlem, an area known to be a UNIA stronghold. The leader of the UNIA's Harlem division viewed Lenox Avenue between 133rd and 135th Streets as strictly UNIA ground. Given a strong UNIA base in Harlem, it is unsurprising that there were tensions and even some confrontations between pro-Garvey activists and those mobilized by the Friends of Negro Freedom that August. Now, I'm not familiar with this Friends of Negro Freedom, but it's, I don't know what they mean by Negro Freedom. They're not, that group is not around anymore, so, you know, it's hard to tell if it was jealousy or FBI. I don't know. It's, well, we're reading this, but, see the divisions and the scattering. It leaves it hard to tell what's really going on as far as organizing. But the strategies, you know, I don't know how to deal with that. But it's let's say it is almost certainly too simplistic, however, to attribute these tensions to the alignment of Caribbean immigrants with the UNIA and of African Americans with integrationist black groups, although people of Caribbean descent are generally thought to have been more direct in their attacks on American racism. It does not follow that people from the Caribbean were more inclined to act provocatively or violently than were African Americans. Instead, the war of words at leadership level intensified pre-existing tensions and created the conditions where such tensions were more likely to result in threats and confrontations when different groups of supporters encountered each other. Reports of intimidation by Garvey loyalists arose again in New Orleans during the trial of the UNIA men indicted for the murder of James Easton, according to New York Times. Federal authorities have known for weeks that attempts were being made to intimidate U.S. government witnesses and that several of them had stated their lives had been threatened if they aided the prosecution in any way. It was reported that Negroes in New Orleans and elsewhere had acted violently towards others of their race who had complained of having been induced to support the UNIA government. So that's an accusation stating that the UNIA government used intimidation tactics towards other blacks who didn't. Yeah, so that's an accusation there. The month after Easton's assassination in New Orleans, the Washington Post reported the alleged attack by UNIA members on Chandler Owen in Pittsburgh, which was apparently thwarted by the police. The Post article, rather sensational subheading, was Negroes throughout country reported to have been victimized. And the article went on to report a meeting is alleged to have broken up in Chicago by the Garvey supporters, and a policeman shot when he attempted to preserve order. The Negro World had reported shots being fired at an anti-Garvey meeting in Chicago in October 1922. Hmm. Okay. A further example of faction violence within the American UNIA comes from Florida, where the popular UNIA leader and orator Laura Kofi formed an unofficial offshoot of the UNIA for her devoted followers. Over the course of the 1910s, thousands of black people from the British-owned Caribbean islands had migrated to Florida, with well over half of the 10,000 black people in Miami by 1920 originating from these islands. These Caribbean immigrants were unused both to being a racial minority and to the harshness of the Jim Crow-style racial segregation. By early 1921, there was a large UNIA division in Miami composed primarily of Caribbean members, which was probably more radical than many other Southern UNIA branches at the time. Overall, the UNIA could not unite African American and Caribbean immigrants in Florida, and there was often deep hostility between the two groups, based partly on cultural differences. In the Key West, reports speculated that some African Americans had received threats from Caribbean born Garveyites, having failed to lend their support to the UNIA. In 1921, Garvey himself had to take steps to limit the influence of more radical Caribbean elements in the UNIA in the South, particularly in Miami and Key West. During the period of Garvey's trial, incarceration, and eventual deportation, many UNIA supporters in Florida became frustrated with the organization's lack of leadership and progress, and Laura Kofi stepped up to fill the vacuum, essentially forming a new faction of the organization in Florida and in some coastal areas of the Gulf states, much to the anger of many Garvey loyalists. In March 1928, after a period of tension in southern Florida between Kofi's faction and Garvey's local supporters, Kofi was shot dead while leading one of their meetings in Miami, probably by a Garvey loyalist, in what was rumored to have been an execution ordered by the UNIA hierarchy. The crowd who witnessed the killings of Kofi was enraged and subsequently turned on and killed Maxwell Cook, the head of Miami's African Legion, in revenge for Kofi's death. Yeah. It is likely that Kofi became such a controversial figure. Let me see it. Let me see it. Let me see about that previous paragraph. She is buried in Jacksonville, Florida, where I'm at. You know, the Chess Foundation, the houses that Garvey stayed in those same houses. That's yeah, that allegation. Yeah, that's say the crowd witnessed it. Huh. So you don't know if there was FBI involvement or just uh yeah, it's ugly. All right. It is likely that Kofi became such a controversial figure, at least in part, because she upended the UNIA's gender hierarchies in which women were generally allowed to be influential, but not to the point where they surpassed men. Overall, the examples of the deaths of Kofi and Isan suggest that UNIA's widespread geographic reach and hierarchical structures of a particular brand of conservative nationalism could at times lead to internal instability for the organization. These case studies demonstrate some of the processes by which rival leaders and different visions could arise, which tension then having the potential to develop along gender and ethnic lines. Now, this is interesting. I noticed both Isan and Kofi were, actually, how would you say? They were actually ministers, so they created, uh, so, with ministers, pastors, they used to collect money from speaking, so oratory. So by creating a similar system, now you're fighting over money, essentially. You're fighting over money, pastor collections. So it's that religious aspect is not pointed out. They're trying to point out some gender issues here or whatnot, but you know, gotta be careful with religion as a mobilizing tool. You know, pastors get to fighting, and that's the ugly. But overall, the examples of deaths of Kofi and Isan suggest that the UNIA's widespread geographic reach and hierarchical structures of its particular brand of conservative nationalism can at times lead to internal stability for the organization. These case studies demonstrate some of the processes by which rival leaders and different visions could arise, with tensions then having the potential to develop along gender and ethnic lines. Isan's death sheds light on how quickly power struggles could escalate within the American UNIA, with ethnicity being used to both claim legitimacy and to discredit opponents. The death of Kofi arose from a context of long-standing radicalism and disillusionment within the Caribbean community in Florida, a milieu which eventually disrupted UNIA gender norms and set a new faction against more conservative Garvey loyalists. A more straightforward rift over power also developed between Garvey and William Sherrill, the acting president general of UNIA during Garvey's time in prison in Atlanta, as Garvey began to suspect Sherrill of maneuvering to displace him as the most influential figure in the organization or within the government. Garvey's battles against his enemies, both internal and external, had taken their toll by 1927, when the Justice Department eventually agreed to release Garvey from prison in Atlanta, where he had been incarcerated since his appeal against the mail fraud conviction had been turned down. He was released only on the condition that he be immediately deported. Garvey sailed from New Orleans to Jamaica in December 1927 and did not return to the United States. The American UNIA has not fully recovered from this blow, and it gradually fragmented, though it persisted directly and indirectly in some areas of USA for years after Garvey's departure, a fact often overlooked by historians. Yeah, they still exist in factions to this day. Different factions upon factions. Okay. As the power vacuum deepened within American UNIA, tensions between rival groups exacerbated the development of factionalism in New York City. In 1929, the Tiger Division of the African Legion clashed violently with city's more conventional Garvey Club, in what probably indicates class and ethnic divisions between different groups of UNIA supporters. The rise and fall of Lord Kofi in Miami can also be understood in the context of the post-Garvey power vacuum that afflicted the organization after 1927. Let's see. Animosity flared at times between UNIA supporters and external groups after Garvey's departure in 1930. For example, after a period of tension in Harlem, a street brawl between the UNIA's Tiger Division and local communists left one communist supporter dead on the street. While scholarly discussions of black political rivalries in this period tend to focus on personal vendettas between Garvey and other black leaders, the examples discussed in this study demonstrate that the war of words between the leaders was not separate from grassroots rivalries and confrontations between supporters. At times, these grassroots rivalries did not extend beyond words and threats, while at other times they manifested as physical confrontations. Overall, these examples indicate that tensions between UNIA supporters and the supporters of other black organizations comprised primarily of threats, both physical and verbal, that could be confrontational, but only occasionally escalated into notable instances of outright physical violence. Ultimately, there's not enough evidence to make firm assertions about the precise ethnicities of those activists who opposed each other at grassroots level. However, such tensions most likely speak primarily to the presence and agendas of prominent leaders in certain places and at certain times, and to the fact that supporters of different organizations were in close proximity to each other in the urban centers of black activism, most notably in Harlem, New York. While there are clear links between the UNIA and Caribbean ethnicity in New York City, this study has not attempted to argue that people of Caribbean descent were more inclined toward violence than were American-born black people. Instead, while issues of ethnicity probably exacerbated certain political tensions, grassroots tensions between UNIA and other organizations, UNIA government and other organizations, were also intrinsically linked to the presence of prominent national level leaders such as Bagnall, Owen, Pickens, and Randolph in Harlem, August 1922, and Owen in Pittsburgh, February 1923. On the other hand, the prominent examples of tension within the American UNIA itself more obviously highlight the impact that ethnic and even gender hierarchies could have in exacerbating pre-existing differences and rivalries, with these disputes sometimes escalating into deadly physical violence. The militarism evident in the creation and activities of the African Legion meant that martial tendencies, that means warfare tendencies, martial tendencies were an inherent part of the UNIA. In the interior of the South, an area where African Americans were usually the only black group, these expressions of militarism usually spoke to respectability through group self-defense against white violence. In larger urban centers, however, where leadership machinations and grassroots rivalries manifested themselves more obviously, the presence of the African Legion could have the effect of enabling the often shadowy, politically motivated intimidation, coercion, and violence that some UNIA government supporters became involved in. Although such political violence against other black people may seem unrespectable compared to self-defense against white attack, it's not possible to make clear assertions about the social class of those involved in such political violence. Instead, this study has suggested that expressions of violence were more likely linked to certain combinations of circumstances rather than to social class or ethnic factors as much as such. Yeah, I got half a page. So it's just going through a review of what's already been stated. Let me just wind down. All right. Scholars who discuss the UNIA's involvement in the rivalries of the 1920s generally lay the blame for any violence on the UNIA, a tendency that may have its origins in the writings and pronouncements of Garvey's rivals at the time. Although the forthright criticism that UNIA government attracted has often been taken to mean that it was essentially doomed to fail, historians' approaches to UNIA should avoid being overly influenced by the comments made by leaders of rival organizations or by its enemies in the press, both black and white. It is noticeable that the white press reported the involvement of police officers in several of the incidents covered in the study, indicating that the white press routinely both denigrated the UNIA and glorified the actions of the police. Furthermore, the state had a vendetta against the UNIA that had begun as early as 1919 and contributed via police interference and a long-standing Bureau of Investigation campaign to the development of tensions. The white press and white authorities may even have a symbiotic relationship in this regard, with the prejudice of one stoking that of the other. The authorities believed that from an early stage in the UNIA's propensity for violence, and it probably helped the cause of white officialdom to actively attempt to expose, provoke, and subdue the UNIA government. This may be an area of speculation, but nonetheless, the circumstantial information points to each such questions about the roles of the press and the state in creating and perpetuating certain situations and perceptions regarding the UNIA and its involvement in political violence. While it seems to have been the case that the UNIA was the organization most often involved in grassroots political confrontations, this study has suggested that we need to understand such confrontations in the context of the UNIA's internal dynamics and in the context of its relationship both with other black organizations and with the white power structure. Such an understanding of the UNIA's involvement in UNIA government's involvement in political confrontations and violence can move us away from the temptation to reduce UNIA supporters to lower types of cranks, crooks, and racial bigots. Instead, properly contextualizing and understanding such tensions can provide us with and appreciation of the pressures, influences, and shifting circumstances that shaped Black activism in the interwar period, and of how and why wars of words had the capacity to spill out into outright violence. All right, that'll be a wrap. 25 minutes. All right, let me end this.